right. Well, as Fred said, I'm Shelley, Davies Wygant. And it's good to be back in the OEC. I moved here to Ellicott City in 1997 and bought a historic house. It was the White Duck Bed and Breakfast, if anybody remembers it, up on College Avenue. It was the Keister house. So moved in, we're gonna redo this house and everything. And the next thing you know, Sonny Wayland of the Historical Society ropes me into the holiday house tour. And then I was corresponding secretary, and then I was president, and then, this is how it goes. So if you want to get involved with the Historical Society, prepare to be president someday. So when I moved here, I knew nothing about Howard County or Ellicott City, and got into the history of it. And it's just Ellicott City, especially, a fascinating little place, a gem. It's just filled, every nook and cranny is just filled with a story and everything. And so I wrote the, Haunted Ellicott City book first with 30 sites. I didn't even get them all in. And it was fascinating. Every other building is haunted. So I wrote that, and then, a couple other things I didn't get to fit in. I thought, well, maybe Haunted Howard County. I thought, we'll see what's out there. Well, people started crawling out of the woodwork with, oh, you need to look at this house because it's haunted, and this is haunted. And Facebook was very, very helpful because I sort of cast a net out there and said, do you know of any, haunted houses? And people, stuff I found out was just incredible. Some stuff around Ellicott City that's well known, but stuff that I had never heard of, and some very disturbing sort of things. So that's how I got into this book. I started, writing it, and these are really fun to do because you have a combination of your studying history, and what I do is I research the history of the building all the way back, and then have the ghost stories. So.
My timing is impeccable. Boom, there you go.
Okay.
You ready to rock and roll, Fred? You good?
Yeah.
My job best by.
Wait when you want me to advance. All right. Let me just in.
Okay, there it is. Ta-da!
Hey,
Ta-da.
technology.
First I'm going to give you a really brief history of Howard County, because you may not know Howard County. So Howard County for, up until the 1600s, it was Indians and animals and wilderness and so forth. And then when Captain John Smith of Jamestown made his way up the Tasco River, he was mapping the Chesapeake and everything. So he was like kind of the first Howard County, what would be Howard County, that came up the river. And then in 1687, a Puritan colonial settler named Adam Shipley received the county's first land grant from Lord Baltimore, patented as Adam the First. And if you know, I guess it's 103, you see Shipley's grant, that whole thing, that's where that was. So that was the very first, land grant. And during colonial times, in America, a governor could sell or give away land to soldiers, farmers. I mean, it was like, hey, have some land, And so Howard County had a total of 359 land grants. And if has anybody looked at a list of land grants or a map of land grants? They're crazy. They have crazy names like Rancher's Ridge, The Mistake, Lost by Neglect, Hard to Get, Dear to Pay For. And they range from John Carroll had like 7,000 acres. And then they were down to under 100 acres. And the tradition has it that some of these land grants were so small and inconsequential that these landowners would win and lose them in card games. So, it was just like this conglomeration stuff. It's very interesting. Who was it that did the map It was like yeah, that it was just a mishmash, and this guy really put together the map. And I know the Historical Society has it for you to look at. So anyway, of course, Elkett Mills, 1772. That really kind of jump-started the county. You know that prior to that, all the farmers were they were planting wheat. They were planting tobacco, and tobacco is really hard on the soil, and they depleted the soil. So the Elketts came down from Bucks County, and they were millers, and they said, you know what? If you put plaster of Paris in the soil, it'll sweeten it up, and you can grow, guess what? Wheat that we can mill. So that was a turning point in the agriculture. So then everybody was milling. The Carrolls were growing wheat. They started the road down to Ellicott City, and it went from there. Around 18, Savage Mill was in 1822. So that was a textile manufacturing plant. So in 1839, the area was designated as the Howard District of Anne Arundel County. How many people knew that Howard County was originally part of Anne Arundel County? Oh, everybody's so smart. And the name Howard comes from John Eager Howard, who was a Revolutionary War hero. It became the independent jurisdiction of Howard County in 1851. And so the county started growing, and places like Lisbon and Clarksville and stuff like that started popping up. Interesting thing, Civil War broke out, the county was divided. There were Northerners and Southerners. And in Cooksville on Route 97, Confederate General Judge Stewart got waylaid en route to the Battle of Gettysburg by a skirmish with Union troops. He captured him, but the delay was enough to prevent him from getting into the battle in time to help avert the Confederate loss. So that's interesting tidbit of Howard County history. And so after that, it was an agricultural town. It was just hanging out for 100 years and everything. I mean, county seat and everything. And then Columbia came along. And Rouse bought up all this property. And I have it in the thing, surreptitiously. And he had his secretary go and buy these little farms. And in one moment in Howard County history, this lady owned like $18 million worth of property that she handed over to Rouse. So everybody thought they were dealing with, Susie the secretary, who was buying it for her parents or something like that. And we know what happened from there, growth engine, and, we're in where we are in Howard County today, which is, top 10 places to live. Yeah, that was good. Thank you. So, yeah, the upper part of Anne Arundel, they just chopped it off. And I don't know. Does anybody know the actual reason? Probably administrative. Who knows? It's probably boring. Okay. Our next slide is the kinds of hauntings. Now, some of you may be ghost fans or whatever, or not, but in the realms of ghostly things, there are different kind of hauntings that you may have heard of. And probably the one you hear most about is poltergeists, that poltergeist means noisy ghost. And these are ghosts that make noises. They also move things. They're typically not a threat or anything, although in a couple instances things were thrown at people, and that could be a bad thing. But that's, when you hear these knocks and taps and things like that, that's a poltergeist. Then there's an ectoplasm or ectomist. It's a ghost that appears, just a figure, ones that you just see and they're sort of sometimes they appear becoming a full body apparition. Many people have witnessed them outdoors in graveyards, battlefields, and historical sites. Then there's the interactive personality, and it's also called an intelligent haunting. And this is the haunting where the person is there. They can interact with you. They might interact with you. They may have had a problem passing over. They may not want to pass over. They may not know they're dead. And these are the ones where you interact with them and they interact back. Orbs you've heard of, supposedly, and I've seen them in photographs, they are like little balls, and supposedly this is how spirits travel, and they can be photographed. And then they have something called funnel ghosts that they say is most often in old historical buildings, and it's a vortex that's associated with a cold spot. And in these stories I'm going to tell you, some of these kinds of ghosts will show up. And they said they're a loved one returning for a visit, former resident of the house, might be a wisp of light, and they are often caught in photographs. So I think go to the next. So where are, we know Ellicott City is supposedly the most haunted town in Maryland, and some say on the East Coast or whatever. But in this book, we talk about, they're kind of scattered across the county. I tried to get a good mix. So we have Ellicott City, we have 4, Elkridge 2, Savage 1, Columbia 2, Western, in general, we have 5, and Sykesville, we have 2. So, wherever you are, so are the ghosts. So let's go to the next slide. Please. And I think who recognizes this house? Anybody? How come we have it superimposed?
I don't.
You don't know?
You sent this to me.
It's not
Sean's fault.
Sean's.
He's gone.
Good. He's one. That's the thing you want to do. This is on Hill Street in Ellicott City, and it's up on the up on the hill on Hill Street. It's a charming little house that I often looked at and said, I wonder where that, what the story is, because a lot of them is like, oh, there's the Patapsco Female Institute, there's the, Mount Ida, and this pretty little house up on the hill really, didn't know. So it was fun to research it. So it was probably built in the early 1800s on land patented to Thomas Elias and William Brown in the 1700s, and I think the first real owner was Louis Timanus. Is it Timanus? And he was a judge up in Randallstown. And he owned it, I think just kind of, might have owned the property or had the house built. But he had a half-sister named Louisa. And her name, Louisa Timanus. And she went to the Patapsco Female Institute, of course. And was living in Ellicott City, and she married Isaac Strawbridge, who was a clothier. Isaac Sullivan Strawbridge, and he had a dress shop. So they weren't wealthy, I think they had some financial challenges. So Isaac died there. Louisa had a grandchild born, and then in 1889, Louisa died, and she at the age of 78, and she was a member of Emory United Methodist Church, and so they had kids there and everything. Margaret. Financial problems, passed away. John Arthur Stewart was a descender. Anybody know John Arthur Stewart? They were They lived at Hill House until August of 1954, when they sold property to Albert Ann and Paul Willard McDonald. And they probably bought it as an investment because they owned Spring Hill, if anybody's familiar with it. So they owned it, and it kind of fell into disrepair, like serious disrepair. So in 1968, a gal named Diane Gale Schulte bought the house. And there's a picture of the house in the book that it's insanely whatever. So she recalled the look of the house and said, I had to force my way through a jungle of trash, vines, and tree roots that had penetrated the stone walls and into the ground floor. The house was just a shell. You could see the sky through a big hole in the roof. A November rain was pouring through the upper floors down to where I stood, amid the dirt and debris around the rotted log floor. There was no heating, plumbing, or electricity. The only occupants for the past 25 years had been rats. What am I? I mean, and she bought it for $4,000, so might have been high for that. So she was a part-time realtor, a law student. She eventually became a judge, and she really fixed the place up. It was on the pilgrimage one year, and the house passed. After her, passed to Tuchmeyer, Farnsworth, Ron Rizolo lived there, and so that's the history of that. It's interesting, and Louisa will figure in. The judge who I talked to never saw anything in the house. I asked her, I said, have you seen anything weird? She's like, yeah. But a person who did, if you're familiar with Casey Calder, Rose Calder's daughter from Green Willow, Crazy Willow. Anyway, she rented the place, and she was a person that sort of kind of felt spirits. She was sensitive to them. So she lived there and had various encounters with this ghost. So the first time she was sitting alone in the second floor living room, and there was a loud clap, and came again. She wasn't really scared, but then she thought there might have been an intruder. So she went up to the third floor thinking she'd trapped the intruder up there, and there was nothing, nothing up there. So the next time she encountered this ghost, she was awakened from a dead sleep by the distinct sensation that somebody was hovering over her, breathing directly and heavily onto her sleeping face. So she was like, okay, I'm going to talk to this ghost. I'm going to give them what for. Calder told that whoever come upon her that waking her up like that was uncool. She assured the spirit that she knew it was there, and that's kind of the mark of an intelligent haunting. Because a lot of times these spirits, sometimes they just want to be acknowledged. They just want recognition that you're there. Sometimes they want other stuff. I'll tell you a brief, quick side story. In my first book, I talk about the hauntings here. And the basement is notoriously haunted here at the Historical Society. So my husband and I were here for a concert, and we're having a good time, and I'm drinking wine, and I'm like, and my husband senses things. So I said, Jeff, let's go down to the basement. And it was pitch black, and steps go down there, and there's an office on the right, and Karen will tell you creepy stuff happens. And so we're like, okay, we're gonna go downstairs. And my husband stops at the bottom of the steps, and he said, I'm not going any further. And I'm like, what? Come on. And he said, I'm not going any further. I said, why? He said, there's somebody in that room, and it wants something. Which gave me a chill. I was like, okay. I'm a person, I don't personally feel stuff or sense stuff, but I am respectful, and I'm not going to mess with it. Because you hear a lot of bad things when people challenge ghosts and stuff like that. So anyway, so this is a ghost that interacts. So she told her, don't mess with me, don't scare me like that again. And the ghost seemed to be okay with that. And then she described this ghost as like a friendly presence, that it felt like a hug every time she went into the house. It was she really liked it. And the ghost had full room in the house, although it slept in the room at the top floor. In case you got the sense that the ghost was an older woman, average build, who wore her hair up in a bun, prim and proper, didn't cook, and may have had a dog. I mean, how do you know these sorts of things? I don't know, but this is what she said. Anyway, for whatever reason, the elderly spirit was drawn to an antique wardrobe in the bathroom on the 3rd floor, and the ghost especially liked a crystal atomizer that she had. So eventually a communication breakthrough came when the lights on the 3rd floor stopped working. So check the light bulbs, everything's good, and she decided to ask the ghost if she was doing it. So she said, flicker the lights twice. Are you doing it? Flicker the lights twice if the answer is yes. And it came back in the affirmative. She asked another question. Do you want me here? Again, flickered yes. Friends who came were introduced to the ghost. They interacted her. Case always told visitors that the Hill House belonged to the spirit. They had to respect it and her. So eventually the day came when Casey, she was a renter, she's going to move on. But she really, really, really liked this ghost, and felt an affinity, and asked the ghost if she would come with her, to her next place. And the ghost said that she couldn't. So Casey asked if the spirit she'd like to come to her new home or perhaps visit. Ghost said no. While she was gathering her things in the 3rd floor bath, she picked up the antique perfume atomizer, and she asked the ghost, would you like to have this? And the ghost flickered the light twice and said yes. So what she did, she took a crystal atomizer, and this is this old house, and there's always nooks and crannies in old houses. So she took the crystal atomizer and she hid it in the wall of the building. So it's probably still there, and said, this is for you. And when I talked to her afterwards, and she didn't know about my research and everything, and she said and evidently this ghost stays around that house, although I think this may be the same ghost that haunts the PO, the name tourism, because that's Louisa, that is in the vicinity. So I said, did the ghost tell you her name? And she said, no, but it was an old-fashioned name, and I think it began with an L. Hello. So this is one of these things where, sometimes the stories line up with history, and you say, hey, that's probably Louisa, and that's other times, Castle Angelo, the story of the, artist who ghost drags you out the back of the building and kills you if you don't like art. No such person. But it's fascinating to find out, because when it intersects, it's great. So that is the haunting of Hill House. Our next one is Belmont. So everybody kind of knows Belmont. Everybody familiar with Belmont? Very famous historical place in Howard County. Tons of history. And it's quite old. But there's some interesting. There's a ton of ghosts there. Has anybody been on the ghost tour there at Belmont? Because they have ghost tours. I hear they're good. So the history of the house, it was originally a 1,300 acre land grant called Moore's Morning Choice that was survived by Dr. Mordecai Moore, a founder of the Friends Society of Maryland, and a land speculator. So that was in 1695. So in 1732, Caleb Dorsey, which is a big name, in Howard County, of Hockley in the Hole, on the Severn River, and his wife Eleanor Warfield, another big name, and they bought the property. They had 13 children, and one of them was Caleb Jr., who was an avid fox hunter, and evidently went fox hunting in search of a rare gray fox, and he met neighbor Hill's teenage daughter, Priscilla Embry Hill, and they struck up a friendship. And they were married young, and so a little after a year, they were married. The Dorsey said, "Here, have a house," which was common in Howard County. It's like, oh, yeah, if there's an extra house, happy wedding, here's your house. In 1738, they built this colonial Georgian house. The original center part of the house, 50 foot wide, and on either side of the front door, they installed 2 carved plaques that read CPD 1738, and their initials, which is their initials, and the date the house was built. One of the things, if you go to Belmont, and you really should, is that Dorsey was very superstitious, and they bolted huge iron crosses onto the door, and these were known as witches' crosses. They're part of a New England tradition that you put these things on your house to prevent evil spirits from getting in. And you'll see that didn't really work. And they were made of iron, and the interesting thing about, and Caleb may not have known this, but iron is supposed to protect against witches, fairies, and evil spirits, and iron has been used since classical times to ward off these spirits. So they build this house, they start filling it up with a bunch of children, and there's a lot of begats that I'll spare you with. Among them were Dorsey's son, Edward Strong-Fisted Big Hard Ned, who became known as Ironhead Ned. And Ed was, pretty good businessman. He expanded the estate to over 3,000 acres. Then Dorsey had a daughter named Priscilla, and she eloped in 1805 with Alexander Conti Hanser Jr. And she was living with a relative in Baltimore who wouldn't give their consent. So this guy was a mixed bag, let's say. He was the grandson of a member of Continental Congress, and he must have seemed like a great catch. They had some children. In 1815, the estate was portioned to Priscilla. She received a house along with land. At that point, she christened it Belmont. And her husband, Alexander, in addition to, he also served as a senator, but he was a founder of the extremist pro-British newspaper, the Federal Republican. At the time, his views were so unpopular that a mob attacked the offices of the newspaper. He was accosted and taken to jail, where the mob found him again, beat him, left him for dead, and he seemed to never recover from his injuries. And he departed the world in 1819 at the age of 34. So, as great as, here you have this great plantation, everything, whatever, this guy was messed up. Hansen left very little behind. His, savings were drained. She did all she could do to keep Belmont going, but in the 1830s, she began selling all parts of his land. Because of that, in 1839, she mortgaged it probably for $1,500. Worse than that, her son Charles was a horse racing and gambling addict, and so she thought this guy could fritter away this whole thing. So in the case that Charles ever put the state in jeopardy, he would be transferred to his wife Anna, and it eventually was saved by Anna's family. So with no money to pay the bills, it was reduced to 600 acres. The property went to sheriff's auction where it sold for $25. But because of her will, the auction was contested and the property came back to Charles's and Anna's children. This Charles was superstitious too. He believed that if he did any work on the Belmont family cemetery, it would cause him to go to an early grave. So he neglected the property and it fell into ruin. In 1880, he dies. They're all buried out at Belmont. There's a graveyard in the back. So if you want to go and if you read this book and you see all the names and everything, they're all out there. You know, there were surviving daughters. Things weren't going well. That Miss Nanny and Miss Florence, who lived there, made preserves and pickles to sell, which they stored in the ballroom. They eventually sold, in 1917, they sold the property to their cousin, Mary Bodman Bruce. She was a seventh generation Cato Dorsey. And so the Bruces were kind of whoop-de-doo kind of people. He became successful and recognized for his work as director of material for armed service. So they fixed it up. They restored the cemetery, the grounds, and so forth. They had a prize-winning thoroughbred, which his name was Billy Barton. And when Billy died, they buried him standing up next to the barn in full tack with saddle and bridle on. In 1961, it came into possession of the cousin Bruce. It was sold to the Smithsonian Institute in 1964 for $500,000. This place is a bear to keep up. So in 1983, the Smithsonian sold the house to the American Chemical Society, and then they sold it to Howard County. They sold it to Howard County Community College, which they were going to do a conference center at school, culinary school. I got this thing in front of my face. Some of the people I'm trying to keep around. Anyway, so again, it's really expensive, big property. So they sold it to Howard County. They opened it to public. So in 2012, they sold it to Howard County, who bought it for, they had forgiven a loan, and so it was basically saved. It is still on, I think it's 68 acres, and it preserves what they call the viewscape. And since you guys need to go out there this weekend immediately. And the viewscape is, it's not like, well, you have to kind of go like this because there's a subdivision, or, it looks like it looked, back then. So it's preserved. They have events. It's wonderful. So the ghosts. So I'll read you an excerpt from a 1951 account from the colonial mansions of Maryland. Sometimes on dark and windy nights in the old house, you hear the Belmont ghost. At least once a visitor, winter does it come. Perhaps you're sitting before the open fireplace, in which visitor delighted. You hear the wind lonesomely without, and suddenly there is a sound of horses and the jangling of harnesses. Many horses, evidently, and the harnesses and wheels seem to crank and rumble more heavily than harness and wheels nowadays. You search for the door, but you hear a rustle of other footsteps ahead of you on the same errand that you see now. The door opens, and there's the scraping of feet as people come in. You are now standing up in alarm. What is it? There's only a long, drawn-out sigh, and then there's the sound of some forefather coming down from Annapolis in coach and six. You hear the sounds of the wheels driving away around the house toward the stable, the creak of harnesses and the clattering of hooves. The rest is silence. The woman is heard no more. This is the Belmont ghost. So Belmont is like crawling with ghosts, just absolutely crawling with ghosts. And I said there are ghost tours there, and they go through many of them. So, like we talked about, I didn't mention residual hauntings. That's another kind of haunting. And a residual haunting, they describe as like a recording of an event, that something happened that, sent energy out in the world that stayed, and certain people, it plays over again. So these are the things that when you have ghosts that, always appear, or this always happens, or like this stagecoach thing, which people talk about. This is a residual haunting. It's a recording, a replaying of something that happened. If you said, "Hey, horseman, stop," it wouldn't have any effect. So that's an interesting sort of thing. So some of the ghosts of Belmont is supposedly a 6-year-old child known as Amanda. She's supposed to be the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Conversations with the spirit that this Ron Gutto, who is a spirit investigator over there, he said, we need to go through this stuff fast. We've been here forever. Yeah, you'll have. I mean, there's all kinds of spirits in Belmont, but one of the things that I found interesting is there's a ghost of a man who is seen peering out from the piano, and he is in 19th century garb, and a medium said that so the spirit was maybe involved in a murder just outside the front door. Well, anyway, looked up, sure enough, there was a murder with one of the Hansons. And he's had a neighbor that came from Ilchester to get some seed corn. Stops in the front yard. He wasn't home, but he comes back, and he comes out and shoots this guy dead. Kills him for no reason. Slices his neck, calmly goes back into the house, wipes off the handle thing, and waits. Well, evidently this guy had been out in California and it came back kind of crazy, maybe whatever. They tried him, they convicted him, they sent him to Spring Grove for the rest of his life, which is interesting. So I'm reading this account, like, oh, really? So I look up the census for Spring Grove, and he's on the list. And a few years later, his sister gets committed. So I think there were some scrambly genes in there. All these notes. I don't want to keep you forever. Now it's hard. I'm just gonna do the ghost stuff. Is that good? Skip the history. 'Cause the history, I mean, it's interesting, but let's. God, there's just so many. I mean, we have. Ethel Manor, the Ethel Manor, which is one of the oldest houses in Howard County, has a myriad of ghosts. The Gray House, which is on 97, we can flip through these. That's Ethel. This is the Gray House. It was called the Gray House behind the Snippy, and there is Mr. Howell there. He owned it, and the Gray House is back there. Today it's owned by the Goolsbys. It's a yellow house. It's just down from the senior center. The interesting thing about this one is that they moved in, I think in the 70s, the Goolsbys, and they had an experience where they would come home and all the furniture was moved in the living room. Moved down, whatever. They were like, yeah, this is weird. And they laughed it off. So evidently, this house had been owned by I think a Warfield, and very popular, and entertained a lot. And I think her name was Emma. Anyway, so Mr. Goldie rides the hunt. So he goes to a hunt club breakfast, and he's telling about the poltergeists and everything. And around that time, it's like 75. When you remember Generalissimo Franco was dying and wouldn't stop dying. And they were sort of interested in that for some reason. It captured their imagination. Anyway, and then evidently after Franco died, this stuff kind of quieted down. And so he was telling the story to this Landed Gentry lady, and she said, oh my God, that's probably Emma. And evidently Emma, I think her name was Emma, was a mistress of Generalissimo Franco. So the story was that the night before the revolution began, soldiers appeared at the door, spirited her and her son away, and an armada of 6 ships took them to the coast of France. So after Generalissimo died, the manifestation stopped. So You're gonna have to read these stories. I'm gonna skip, since we're running out of time, to the Gerwig Lintner house, which will be the last slide on the list. And that name is probably not going to ring a bell for you. But if you've lived around the county, it was a house that was.
You're gonna have to tell me which one it is. So that.
No, next. No, maybe come back. It's really, you know what about. That's the Wayside Tavern. We're building, good stories in there. This one is the Mead House. The ghost that haunts that. This is down this road from where I lived on College Avenue. This started out as a stable for College Avenue. And then they built a house on it. And then the Meads, Maud May and Marion Mead, bought it. And they had a son who was maybe not all there. I don't know. He was a mama's boy, whatever. Anyway, the story is that she died. The father died. She died. The son doesn't want to let his mother go. So he leaves her in the east bedroom, seals up the windows, tends to this sort of like Norman Bates-ish, but this is what a neighbor said, tends to, to her body until eventually it was discovered. And I had no idea this house was, my house next door was like 3 houses.
Isn't this near Gerwig?
Yeah, it's around the corner. It's a brown.
It's a rental now.
Is it? Is Steve McKenna not there anymore?
I don't know. I'll tell you.
Yeah. Anyway, so people had experiences of some sort of presence. One's called it the shoegeist because stuff would happen near this closet where she kept her shoe. Another manifestation was like a Chinese checkerboard flew down the hall and cracked one of her kids over the head. The guy who lived there now said that, one night, commotion downstairs, he comes down, all the lights are on, the kitchen's in disarray, and, and so this is probably an intelligent ghost that's trying to make itself known. And there are pictures in the book of Maud May and her son from the Historical Society. But he said he visited her grave and she sort of calmed down a bit. So let's get to the Gerwig Lintner house. That's just up Wayside. That's Salofa, Blue Lady of Salofa. That's Pat
That
Greenwald's house.
seems to be the last.
Okay. Well, that's too bad because the house I'm talking about was at the corner of 144 and Centennial Lane, where La Petite Academy is. And I vaguely remember that, maybe the last little wisps of it. And the house dates from the 1830s. The Gerwigs lived there. They were German immigrants, and they farmed it, for many years. The house, kind of decayed. So the Lintners, who were youngest couple, she was like 37, he was maybe a little bit younger. They buy the house. She fixes, they're fixing it up. Connect with that because we had an old house and, the stenciling and she's doing all this stuff and these things. So she's there one night alone with her dog, Emerson. And she hears commotion in the kitchen. She's like, what's this? And she said, Emerson, is that you? Well, it turns out 2 guys from Baltimore had driven out there to burglarize the house. And so they broke in, they were in the midst of burglarizing and whatever. And one of the burglars, guess what his name was? Emerson. So when she said, Emerson, is that you? These guys panicked. They panicked so much that they murdered her. It was pretty gruesome. It happened, I think, in 1980. I talked to a couple people who were involved in the case, and so they murder her, and they escape down the down probably Frederick Road or whatever, abandoned this truck full of, I mean, they were sewing bicycles and like a sewing machine to kill somebody over there. And they get the police come and they come to this truck and there's a bloody purse and stuff in the front of it. They open it up. What's inside? Blood-stained membership card from the Howard County Historical Society. So anyway, so this poor woman she was murdered in this house that she loved. Her husband stayed on and eventually got married in, I think in 1989. They sold it off to Petite Academy. And this is one I found on Facebook where, it's like, Petite Academy is haunted. I'm like, nah. And they said, I worked there. And so she told me stories of hearing footsteps, things moving. And the most creepy thing of all is that there was a doll in the nursery that sat over the changing table. And every morning they would come in and the doll would be facing the wall every damn morning. You would think that somebody had been murdered that horrifically, it would be a scarier haunting, but it's just maybe that, hey, I'm still here, on the grounds of the house that I loved. That was one of the things, it's like I'm researching and it's like, holy crap. And there are a couple of them in there like that. And forgive me for I probably went too much into the history on the earlier ones. But some of them, there's Savage Mill in there, which has ghost stories and everything. And the story that they say of the little girl who haunts it, that's not the right girl. I found the right girl. Because a lot of them are children who got mangled in the machinery back in the days when there was child labor. So that one's an interesting one. Wayside Inn, that's fairly King's Contrivance, that's another one where somebody was left in the house and maybe still there. So good. I haven't spoiled it for you. There are, I think, 16 sites in here with the history, and some people are more interested in history, and some people, like the ghost stories. People said, "Is all this true?" And I was like, "Well, the history is true as far as I can tell. I try to get it close, with ancestry and whatever. I mean, there are a couple things, but the hauntings, you take it for what it's worth. If you believe it, if you don't believe it, if it, hangs with history, that's great. You can have a brief question and answer period if you like. Anybody have any questions? Hello.
Hi, I'm Alex. I actually manage the Welcome Center.
The which?
The Welcome Center over here on the street at Tourism.
Oh, okay.
And I've been told we have ghosts. And I was looking at
The Bolton Center?
the Welcome Howard County, the tourism.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I got a whole chapter. I had 2 books. The Welcome Center is like haunted as all get out, and I think it maybe Louisa.
It was a funeral home.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
And I know Ed Lilly said he could smell flowers.
Mhm.
Very strong scent of flowers down in one of the basement sections. I'm not sure what it looks like right now.
It's
because of the floods.
yeah, the basement, and then you have the Welcome Center itself.
Yeah, it has been renovated so much, so.
Right.
So have you heard anything there?
Somewhat, nothing personal, we do have one of our resource officers, Mr. Jason. He describes during the height of COVID, literally no one, listened to the office. Because he'd be there later around, not later, around 8 p.m. and his light would go out, go scrambling, and he would see shadows kind of drifting that way towards our kitchen. I luckily started just in summer, so it's been nice and bright and sunny. And I don't really been in the dark days, I was like, oh, I gotta go sit down. But we do have issues with technology. I was told that was, and so it was July, right? So it was just well because for some reason So I mean, could it be a full term instead? Of course. I would prefer to live with So, but it is, we'll see what, the days getting.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can get a hold copy, which I am, going to sign or whatever, of Haunted Ellicott City, that's covered. The old Easton Funeral Home is another good one. Mount Ida,
Which I never felt anything about.
yeah,
I mean, it's supposed to be peace.
yeah,
However, in historic Ellicott City, when they went to the show house the second time, they said that those candles that you can take to the back remote, that they would go up and down when you were there. So, but I never experienced when we were up there for a while as friends who came by. Nothing.
Yeah.
But here,
yeah,
even Hank is very skeptical. But we would work here and hear footsteps and the doors were locked and hello, and the basement, the bathroom in the basement, we hear rapping on the door, and other people have told me that later, that they kind of knocking on the door with the bathroom upstairs.
So, yeah, I may expand this book because there's stuff I couldn't put in, like supposed to be Sandhill Antiques is supposed to be haunted, Ingrid's place, the church, yeah, and so, it's amazing, if you're interested in history, it's all there, and if you just want the ghosts, that's all.
Do you think creative people have more ability to see these things than an analytical person?
Maybe, I think that people, maybe you're born that way or just have it. I mean, I'm interested in it. I personally am glad I do not see or hear things because it would freak me out. But it's interesting when I do book signings, I can always see the people who are going to buy the book. It's your wife, and you're going to come by and say, it's bullshit, And the guys are like, nah, for the most part. Also, African Americans seem to be less interested, and this is just anecdotal, and Asian Americans. And I don't know if it's their culture, their relationship with ghosts, or I don't know what that is, but it's ladies of a certain age who are interested in it and seem to enjoy it, which I have. I mean, it's fascinating.
I like learning about the people themselves, what happens to them.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting stories.
Oh yeah, people that that I found out who died in various things, and like the ghost at Avoca is supposed to be Emily. It's not Emily. It's somebody else in the family, but that's what it's Emily. Emily's the ghost. You'll find out why she isn't in the book, and those are fun things to find out. And I got to talk to families, like Gloria Hatcher. She's a descendant of the Avoca people.
That's Judgment Hill, isn't it?
No,
Avoca.
the show house. That was the Thomas.
Nine ghosts there.
Well, I didn't hear about 9 ghosts. I heard well, there was some other stuff that happened too. So, yeah. So, anybody else have any joys and concerns?
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate you being here today.
Sit back here if you have any desire to purchase a book and have it signed. It's also available on Amazon. And thank you for coming.
I want to thank you all for coming today. We'll see you next month.